My name is Elara Merritt. I am 45 years old. For 27 years, I dedicated my life to this nation as an officer within the United States Cyber Defense Command. I led missions that most civilians will never learn existed. I carried the burden of classified knowledge that kept countless people safe, even as it quietly cost me pieces of who I was. But the deepest wound I ever suffered did not come from foreign threats. It came from the people I trusted most in the world, my own family. And it unfolded inside a courtroom. I can still picture the way they looked at me that morning. My parents, my younger brother Lucas, his wife Eva, faces I had known my entire life. Now, somehow foreign, cold, practiced, rehearsed. They call me a failure. They ridiculed me for abandoning the family while I spent decades in uniform. They declare me mentally unstable, incapable of sound judgment, unworthy of what they had decided I no longer deserved. They wanted everything: the house I grew up in, the wealth I had quietly built through years of sacrifice, even the custody of my own name and my rightful place in our family's history. I stood there in full military uniform, listening to my own mother speak about me as though I were a complete stranger. My father nodded gravely, as if this courtroom spectacle was somehow breaking his heart. Lucas and Eva sat side by side, hands intertwined, cast as heroes in a story of their own invention. And for a long time, I said nothing. I let them speak. I let the world believe I was exactly what they had painted me to be: cold, selfish, damaged. Because I was not interested in winning the room. I was after something far greater: the truth. When my moment arrived, I reached for the one thing I had carried with me throughout it all: a single sheet of paper. I walked toward the judge, slow and deliberate, each footstep echoing through the charged silence of that courtroom. I set the paper down. I met his eyes and said calmly, "Sir, with your permission, I believe this should be reviewed before any further ruling is made." He adjusted his glasses. He read the first line, then the second, and I watched the transformation happen. His expression shifted, his eyes widened. He placed the paper down and lifted his gaze toward the bailiff. "Close the doors," he said, his voice measured but firm. "No one moves." My parents went pale. Lucas froze, bewilderment flickering across his face. Eva whispered something I couldn't catch, her hands visibly trembling. And then they came, federal agents, uniformed officers, moving with swift, practiced silence. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, hurried footsteps, the sound of metal as handcuffs clicked into place. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply stood and watched the walls of their elaborately constructed deception crumble in real time. The truth is, I could have confronted them sooner. I could have shouted, accused, made a scene. But that is not who I am. I am a soldier. I know how to wait. I know how to gather. I know how to strike, once and with precision. What they never grasped was that while they were busy playing petty games over inheritance and family standing, I was unraveling something far darker and far deeper than any of them had imagined. They believed they were stripping me of money, of property, of dignity. They had no idea they were exposing themselves to a reckoning that would leave none of them unscathed. And as the judge ordered the arrests, as my family sat there stunned and broken, I felt nothing. No triumph, no fury. Only a quiet, unshakable certainty. Some battles are not waged on distant shores. Some are fought in still rooms under fluorescent lights, with the weight of years pressing down on your chest. This was my battlefield, and I had already won. The paper I placed on the judge's desk was not merely evidence. It was the culmination of months of silent endurance, careful investigation, and an absolute refusal to let betrayal rewrite my story. They mocked me for failing. They demanded everything. All it took was one sheet of paper to change everything. And the moment those courtroom doors shut, their fate, like their lies, was sealed. The first warning came quietly, the way most betrayals do. It was a Tuesday morning. I remember because I was seated at the old kitchen table, sipping burnt coffee from a chipped mug, when the email arrived. Subject: confirmation of veteran relief enrollment. Sender: National Military Assistance Fund. I frowned. I hadn't enrolled in any relief program. I had no need to. My military benefits were secure. My finances, though modest, were stable. At first, I assumed it was a scam, one of those phishing attempts targeting service members. But then I saw it. The email contained my full name, my military ID, my home address, this address. It even referenced deployment dates that were not part of any public record. Something twisted in my chest. I clicked through carefully. There it was, an application already approved for financial hardship assistance. The funds had been dispersed to an account I didn't recognize. I closed the laptop. My hands were still, but I felt the cold knot tightening in my stomach. Later that day, I placed a quiet call to an old contact in federal finance, someone who owed me a favor. It took less than an hour for the picture to begin assembling itself. This house, had been refinanced 3 months prior. Ownership had been quietly transferred into the name of a shell company. The same company Lucas had been boasting about at Thanksgiving 2 years earlier. The one he had dismissed as a side hustle. Except this side hustle now held the deed to my parents' home. The home I had helped pay off using combat pay for my 3rd tour. I sat alone in the guest room that night, the only space that still felt like mine, and reviewed the documents one by one. The signatures, the timelines, the way my name had vanished from official records like smoke. And then I noticed something else, small, almost negligible. A photocopy of the most recent transfer carried a faint blue smudge in the corner. Just a trace, but familiar. Printer ink. Lucas used to have that same stain on his fingertips when he was a teenager working part-time at a print shop. He hated how the ink clung no matter how hard he scrubbed. The following morning, I found him in the living room, casually scrolling through his phone, Eva draped against his shoulder like some picture-perfect suburban tableau. I held up the printed deed transfer. My voice was calm. "What is this, Lucas?" He barely glanced at it. "It's a business thing. Dad and Mom signed off. It's not a big deal." My mother's eyes darted toward my father. He cleared his throat, but said nothing. I pressed further. "Why has my name been removed? Why wasn't I told?" Lucas shrugged. "You're never here. You don't need the house. We were just consolidating assets." I laughed softly, the sound brittle in my throat. "Consolidating. That's what you're calling it." Eva chimed in then, her voice thick with artificial sweetness. "You've been through so much. I think maybe you're overreacting. This is just practical for the family." The family. As though I no longer qualified for that definition. I looked at my mother. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, the diamond in her wedding ring catching the morning light. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I tried once more. "Did you know? Did you sign this?" Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. Lucas explained everything. "It's for the best." Something inside me fractured. Not loudly, not visibly, just quietly, like a hairline crack spreading through glass. I nodded once, then left the room. No one followed. In the hallway, I passed the mirror and caught my own reflection. The uniform, the medals, the silent witness to everything I had been and everything I apparently no longer was. For the rest of that day, no one spoke of it again. We ate dinner as though nothing had happened, trading words about the weather, grocery lists, television programs. But everything had changed. I lay awake that night, the faint scent of lavender from my mother's laundry soap clinging to the sheets, and I arrived at something cold and undeniable. This wasn't about a house. This wasn't about money. This was a deliberate choice they had made. And in making it, they had already told me exactly where I stood, outside. The lawsuit arrived 2 weeks later. I remember the weight of the envelope when I first held it, heavier than it should have been, as though the paper inside already carried the full burden of betrayal. My name printed cleanly on the front, the Merritt family crest in the corner. Polished, official, cold. When I opened it, I read the words over and over, but for a long stretch they refused to make sense. Plaintiff, Lucas Merritt. Defendant, Elara Merritt. Claims, misappropriation of family trust funds. Undue influence. Emotional distress. Emotional. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands didn't shake, they never do. But something inside me, something fragile, gave way. I had survived IEDs, rogue drones, cyber attacks designed to cripple entire systems. But this was different. I wasn't being targeted by strangers. I was being erased by the very people who were supposed to be mine. By noon, the story had reached local news. By evening, it had gone regional. Decorated Army colonel sued by family over alleged financial misconduct. Sources say veteran took advantage of elderly parents. The images they used were carefully chosen. My stern military ID photo, a blurred image of me in uniform with arms crossed. The kind of pictures designed to make me appear cold, unreachable, dangerous. I didn't watch the coverage, but the calls began anyway. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly felt the urge to check in, their voices strained, cautious, walking that invisible line between curiosity and judgment. Some didn't call at all. By the end of the week, the silence was louder than any headline. I remember sitting in the corner booth of a downtown cafe, the one I used to visit with my mother during home leave. The waitress recognized me. I could tell by the way her eyes shifted between my face and the television above the counter, where a polished news anchor recounted my supposed crimes. I left without ordering. I kept to myself. I said nothing publicly. In the Army, you learn that sometimes the worst response is an overreaction. You wait, you gather, you watch. But inside, the betrayal sat like a stone in my chest, heavy, immovable. My commanding officer sent an email offering temporary administrative leave to handle personal matters. The language was courteous, but the implication was clear. I was becoming a liability. I accepted the leave. I didn't argue. I needed the time. The days blurred. I spent hours working through legal documents I never anticipated having to read, asset inventories, family trust agreements, financial records stretching back decades. Lucas claimed I had manipulated our parents into surrendering control of the family's assets during one of my deployment leaves. He accused me of wielding psychological pressure, of exploiting my military authority to intimidate them. The language was crafted to wound, to twist my years of service into something grotesque. I could have phoned him. I could have gone to the house. I could have demanded answers. I didn't. Instead, I sat in the quiet. I let the world churn around me. The news, the whispers, the sideways glances. And I thought about my mother's expression the first time I walked through the door after Syria, how even then, something in her eyes had seemed distant. I thought about the casual way Lucas had dismissed my questions about the deed, the rehearsed softness in Eva's voice, too perfectly measured to be genuine. I thought about every homecoming, every time I had returned believing that no matter how brutal the world outside became, this house, these people, would remain constant. And I understood that home no longer existed. I wasn't fighting to preserve a family. I was fighting to reveal a truth. The difference mattered, and so I remained silent. I didn't rush to clear my name. I didn't feed the rumors, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. I cannot pinpoint the exact moment suspicion hardened into certainty. Perhaps it was the way Lucas began avoiding direct eye contact when I asked simple questions, or the way Eva's smile was always too immaculate, her words just a fraction too polished, her tone sweetened to the point of leaving a bitter aftertaste. Or perhaps it was something within me. Perhaps I had spent too long living in a world where patterns meant survival, where reading between the lines could save lives. Perhaps I was constructing threats where none existed. That was the part that frightened me most, because once you've witnessed enough betrayal on the battlefield, your mind can begin manufacturing shadows. But this didn't feel like shadows. It felt real. It began with something small, a discrepancy in a bank statement. A company named Valen Group Holdings kept surfacing in documents connected to the family trust. At first, it meant nothing to me. Then I looked more closely. Valen Group hadn't existed 5 years ago. No public records, no legitimate office, just a name attached to shell corporations and real estate transactions. Lucas was listed as Chief Financial Officer. I worked night after night in the faint glow of my laptop, cross-referencing data with quiet precision. The same methods I had once used to trace terrorist financing across war zones, now directed at my own brother's paper trail. And what I uncovered chilled me. Large sums of money flowing through accounts linked to veteran assistance programs. Loan applications filed under names I recognized, soldiers I'd served alongside. Some deceased, some very much alive, but completely unaware. At first, I suspected identity theft. Then I found Eva's name, her so-called counseling practice, the one she had casually referenced at family dinners as her new passion project, was nothing but a front. A list of patients revealed familiar faces, mostly veterans, men and women I vaguely recalled from local ceremonies or VA hospitals. And suddenly I could see the whole shape of it. The scheme. They weren't simply stealing money. They were harvesting identities, exploiting the vulnerability of veterans, people like me, to generate fraudulent profiles, file for grants, launder funds through Lucas's company, and then bury the evidence beneath fabricated layers of mental health documentation. It was elegant in the most sickening way. And the worst part, my parents' signatures were on everything. At first, I convinced myself it had to be a misunderstanding. Perhaps they hadn't understood what they were endorsing. Perhaps they had been manipulated. Perhaps. But the dates told a different story. The transactions were too consistent. The signatures too precise. The regularity too deliberate to be accidental. I leaned back in my chair, breathing shallow, the walls of the room pressing inward. For the first time, doubt crept in, not just about them, but about myself. About my own mind. Had years of chasing enemies left me so conditioned to find threats that I was now fabricating them? I heard my mother's voice in my head, soft and cautionary, the way she used to sound when I was small. Not everything is a battle. Not everyone is out to get you. I closed my eyes and pressed my fingers against my temples. I wanted desperately to believe that. But then I remembered Lucas's expression when I confronted him about the house. The emptiness, the quiet calculation. And I remembered the ink stains. They had been careless once, sloppy, because they assumed I wouldn't look. Because they assumed I couldn't see. But I saw now, and the more I uncovered, the more the pieces snapped into place. This was not a family dispute. This was not about inheritance or wounded pride. This was organized, methodical, criminal. And somewhere along the way, the people who had once claimed to love me had crossed a line from which there was no return. The problem was I couldn't prove it. Not yet. And somewhere deep within me, that seed of doubt kept twisting, whispering that perhaps I had finally come apart. That I was pursuing ghosts of my own creation. But I kept digging because even if I was wrong, I had to know. And if I was right, then this was far more than a family shame. It was something far, far worse. There's a particular kind of silence that doesn't arise from noise fading. It comes from people pulling away. At first it was subtle. Calls that had come weekly suddenly stopped. Texts went unanswered. Invitations ceased arriving. Friends I had known for years, some from my earliest days in uniform, others from community events, began disappearing from my life one by one. Not dramatically, simply gone, dissolving like morning fog. Even my old commanding officer, the one who had once told me I was the steel backbone of his unit, began to sound different on the phone. Guarded, measured. I could detect the quiet shift in his tone when he said things like, "Maybe you need time to reset, Era. Maybe you've been carrying too much for too long." I told him I was fine. I wasn't. And the more I stayed silent, the wider the distance grew. The lawsuit had rendered me untouchable. No one wanted proximity to the wreckage. Not when the headlines portrayed me as a manipulative soldier exploiting her own family for financial gain. I stopped visiting the cafe, stopped going to the gym. Even a trip to the grocery store became a tactical exercise, in and out before the stares could settle too deeply. Invisibility was easier, but the loneliness carved me hollow from the inside. I had known isolation before, in foreign deserts, in undisclosed facilities, but this was different. This was personal. This was the kind of isolation that whispered, "You were never truly loved to begin with." And still I stayed quiet, because beneath the despair, beneath the bone-deep exhaustion, something else was taking shape. I call it the hum, that faint vibration in the mind when instinct signals that there is more, something not yet visible, a thread buried deep, waiting to be pulled. And so I began to pull. I started small. Old contacts, favors not yet expired, quiet conversations through encrypted channels, no paper trails. I re-examined every document tied to Lucas's company, every grant Eva's therapy practice had applied for. I combed through public records, social media archives, financial disclosures. Most nights I worked in darkness, the only illumination coming from my laptop screen, the house around me asleep, the silence thick enough to suffocate. The despair rose more than once. There were nights I caught myself murmuring aloud, half to myself, half to ghosts. What if they're right? What if this is just me unraveling? But the data didn't lie. Patterns emerged. Connections that hadn't been apparent before. Transfers timed with unsettling precision to my deployments. Fabricated client profiles linked by matching IP addresses. Duplicate signatures. Digital fingerprints I had spent years of military service learning to find. And then came the break. A single flag transaction. A payment routed through a foreign-owned bank I recognized from prior classified work. It wasn't domestic fraud. It was bigger. It was international. For the first time in weeks, something shifted in my chest. Not relief, not yet, but the faintest flicker of oxygen in a room that had been sealed shut. I felt my pulse settle, my breath even out. The despair receded, just slightly, like a retreating tide. I was not imagining this. I was not broken. There was something here, something dangerous, something deliberate, and I was the only one willing to see it. That flicker wasn't much, but it was enough. I began sleeping again, restless and shallow, but sleep nonetheless. I started eating real meals instead of surviving on stale coffee and raw adrenaline. I started remembering who I was. They had taken my reputation, my sense of belonging, my name in some circles, but they had not taken my mind. Not yet, and that was enough to keep going. I knew the road ahead would be grueling, that whatever I was uncovering stretched far beyond a family betrayal. It was something larger, more dangerous. But for the first time in a long while, I felt steady. I felt prepared, and in the quiet, I made myself a promise. I would not allow this to end in silence. There is something mechanical about investigation, nothing like the movies. No sudden breakthroughs, no swelling music as the case cracks open. It is slow, exacting, tedious. Hours spent staring at columns of numbers until your vision blurs. Names traced through databases leading nowhere. Screens examined until doubt becomes a permanent companion. But the thing about patterns is they always leave traces. I started with what I knew, Lucas's company, Valen Group Holdings. I already had the surface-level picture, shell companies, assets shuffling, questionable bank accounts. But I sensed that wasn't the whole story. Not for what I felt in my bones. Not for what I knew was still concealed. I opened my secure laptop. Even on administrative leave, certain doors never close entirely when you have spent your life in military intelligence. I wasn't breaking laws. I was bending them. At first, the transactions appeared ordinary. Business expenses, equipment rentals, consulting fees. But I wasn't searching for what was present. I was looking for what shouldn't have been. I set filters, identified transfers just beneath mandatory reporting thresholds, flagged unusual currency exchanges, searched for offshore entities with registrations in tax havens. Hours dissolved into days. Then I found it, a payment routed through a foreign-owned bank that had been flagged years earlier for laundering cyber ransom proceeds. A name surfaced, indirect, buried 3 layers deep, but unmistakable. POV Risk Management. I knew that name from classified briefings, from restricted reports, from whispered conversations held only behind sealed doors. POV wasn't simply an offshore consultancy. They were linked to industrial espionage, specifically targeting defense contractors, cyber infrastructure, and military supply chains. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. This wasn't about money. This was about information. I went deeper. Another transaction, another name, then another. Eva's therapy practice, the one I had always dismissed as innocuous, was receiving payments from small nonprofit organizations tied to veterans' mental health initiatives. On the surface, it appeared she was consulting on PTSD recovery programs, but the amounts were too large, the timing too deliberate, and then the final piece locked into place. Many of those veterans were people I had served with or individuals connected to bases where I had been deployed, and Some of those names weren't real. They were fabricated identities, constructed to apply for aid programs and grants. My heart stopped when I saw it. Military clearance renewals. Clearance renewals. My breath seized. The scheme was not merely about stealing money. They were extracting personal data that, in the right hands or the wrong ones, could unlock access to restricted systems. Systems containing national security secrets. I sat back, the magnitude of what I was reading pressing down on me like lead. Lucas wasn't sophisticated enough to have engineered this. Neither was Eva. This was bigger, sharper, more deliberate. Someone else was directing it. They were simply the willing instruments. I rubbed my eyes, exhausted but relentless. I cross-checked timestamps, traced IP addresses. Every thread I pulled revealed more decay. Offshore accounts linked to contractors flagged by the Department of Defense. Temporary businesses dissolved overnight after collecting government funds. Anomalous login attempts into restricted military networks, originating from devices at civilian locations. I felt sick. It was a lattice work of greed and espionage, so carefully constructed that had I not lived in this house, had I not known these faces, I would never have spotted it. And they had used my name, my service record, my deployments, my reputation. Because who better to exploit than the soldier too consumed by foreign battlefields to notice the war being waged at home? For a moment, my vision blurred, my hands trembled. Then I forced myself to breathe. This was the part no story ever shows. The moment when fear and fury collide so completely you can no longer separate them. The moment when you understand you've been used not merely as a pawn, but as a shield. That everything you sacrificed was not only unappreciated, it was weaponized against you. I could have stepped away, handed it off, let someone with more authority handle it. But I knew I wouldn't. I couldn't. I closed the laptop. My thoughts raced, but my pulse steadied. The isolation, the bitterness, the grief, it all condensed into a single, crystalline thought. I was done being silent. They believed they could shelter behind family ties, behind the performance of normality, behind the legal walls they had constructed to contain me. They were wrong. I didn't have every answer yet, but I had enough. Enough to know that I was standing at the edge of something far more dangerous than a family dispute. And this time, I was not backing down. The next fracture in the illusion came more quickly than I anticipated. I had barely begun to absorb the magnitude of what I had uncovered when something else surfaced. It began with a name buried inside a data packet so compact, so easily overlooked. The name appeared in the metadata of one of Eva's supposed therapy reports, an encrypted communication tag to an IP address outside the United States. The name, Arvos International. To most, meaningless. To me, it triggered alarms deep in my bones. Arvos was not a corporate shell. They had been flagged years earlier by Joint Cyber Command for covert intelligence operations, specifically extraction of sensitive defense technologies, destabilization of allied security networks, and targeted infiltration through civilian channels. And somehow Eva was connected to them. I remember sitting at my desk staring at that name, my fingertips cold despite the warmth of the room. It was like breaking through ice. Everything suddenly too still, too quiet. Then the phone rang, an unlisted number. I almost didn't answer. Almost. The voice on the other end was distorted, mechanical. Male or female, I couldn't determine. "Stop," it said. "This isn't your war. Walk away." I said nothing. The line clicked dead. I lowered the phone slowly, my heart pounding harder than any battlefield had ever made it pound. This was no longer just about fraud. This was about surveillance, about control, about people who had been monitoring me far more closely than I had understood. The next night, another call. A different number. The same message. "Leave it alone." I didn't sleep. Every sound in the house became amplified. The creak of floorboards, the brush of wind against glass. I felt like prey inside my own skin, breathing shallow, hands restless. It reminded me of my first combat deployment, the days before the initial ambush, when your body registers the wrongness before your mind catches up, when your senses sharpen while your spirit contracts. The dreams began. Or perhaps they weren't dreams, more like fragmented childhood memories. The first time Lucas pushed me into the lake and I nearly drowned. My father pulling me out, his face blank rather than frightened. My mother standing motionless on the dock, neither calling my name nor moving to reach me. The night I took my oath. How Lucas hadn't even attended the ceremony. How Eva had made a joke about me playing soldier that I laughed off because I assumed it meant nothing. I woke drenched in sweat, disoriented. The calls continued, 3 in a single day, then 48 hours of silence, then another at 3:17 a.m., pulling me from shallow sleep. This time the voice was different, softer, almost familiar. "I'm warning you. They're watching. You can't stop this." I sat up, heart slamming against my ribs. "Who are you?" I demanded, but the line had already gone cold. I checked the house, every window, every door. I don't know what I expected to find. Then I saw it. A small black car parked half a block away. Engine off, lights extinguished, but radiating the unmistakable weight of someone sitting inside. I didn't call the police. I knew better. This wasn't casual harassment. It was deliberate. It was organized. I retrieved my Glock from the safe and loaded it without thought. The solidity of it in my hands steadied me. By the time dawn finally crept across the horizon, the car was gone. But something had shifted within me. The fear was no longer crushing. It was sharpening, clarifying. The most dangerous threats are never the ones that scream. They're the ones that whisper, that seep in until the boundary between real and imagined dissolves. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, and made a decision. No more waiting. No more hoping the truth would expose itself on its own. I would find it. I would bring it to light. Whatever they believed they could do to silence me. They had underestimated the wrong woman. I spent the next 72 hours locked to my screens. Every connection Eva had made. Every overseas call Lucas had routed. Every false identity. Every forged document. Every alias. And then I found it. Buried inside an encrypted attachment in Eva's patient files. A single line of text in fragmented code. Package secured. Clearance updates pending. Awaiting extraction. Package. Clearance. Extraction. I wasn't dealing with thieves. I was dealing with operatives. I exhaled slowly, my breath unsteady, and memories returned with new clarity. The look on Lucas's face the day I shipped out for Afghanistan. The way Eva's smile never quite reached her eyes. And beneath it all, the voice of my drill sergeant on the very first day of training. Always assume the enemy is closer than you think. I finally understood. They weren't just close. They were already inside the walls. I knew it had to end face to face. All the data, all the encrypted messages, all the documented transactions, I had them. But none of it would matter until I stood before the people who had set this in motion and looked them in the eyes. I wasn't prepared for how much it would still hurt. I asked them to meet me at the house I was born in, the house I had believed would always be home. When I arrived, they were already there. My mother perched stiffly on the edge of the living room sofa. My father stationed by the window, arms crossed, jaw rigid. Lucas wasn't there. Neither was Eva, just the two people who had raised me, who had once soothed my nightmares, who had once sent letters to war zones signed, "Love always, Mom and Dad." The room was heavy, laden with history. I set the folder on the coffee table without a word. They didn't reach for it. They didn't ask. I spoke first, my voice measured and deliberate. "I know everything," I said. "The financial fraud, the identity theft, the connection to Arvo's International, the clearance data being funneled offshore." My mother's face twitched, barely perceptible. My father's expression remained flat. I continued. "I know Eva's practice is a front. I know Lucas's company is a laundering operation. I know your signatures appear on documents that make this more than simple negligence." I paused. "Tell me," I said quietly, "did you ever stop, even once, to think about who I was to you before you put your names to this?" For a moment, just a moment, something moved through my mother's eyes, something almost resembling regret. It was gone before I could name it. My father cleared his throat. "I think you've misunderstood a great deal. This isn't what you believe it to be." I laughed. Quiet. bitter. "I'm not here for lies," I said. "I'm here for one answer." "Why?" They exchanged a glance, a silent negotiation. Then my mother spoke, her voice brittle. "You've always been distant, even as a child, always somewhere else. Even before the army, before the deployments," she swallowed. "Lucas, he's here. He's family. He's present. He cares about the day-to-day. About us." I stared at her, disbelief settling over me. "Present. He's using you, using your names, using everything this family ever stood for. And you're calling that love?" My voice cracked. I hated how much it cracked. My father stepped in, his words slow and deliberate. "Family is complicated," he said, "and sometimes you have to choose the child who stays." It landed like a blow. I stood perfectly still, the air in my lungs turning sharp and metallic. I thought of the night Lucas left me stranded on the roadside when I was 15. He had taken the car and driven away after an argument. I walked 5 miles home in the rain. I never told anyone. When he returned hours later, my mother called it just siblings being siblings. I thought of the day I deployed for the first time, how no one came to the send-off ceremony except an old college friend. I thought of the birthday cards that stopped arriving after my 3rd tour, the Christmas dinners I missed that went unmentioned, and I understood something terrifying. I had been losing them for years. This wasn't sudden. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even purely about betrayal. It was about belonging, and I had stopped belonging long before any of this began. I stepped back, my breath steady but thin. "Family," I said quietly, "isn't blood. It isn't history. It is an obligation." I looked at them both. Family is choice, and I wasn't the one who stopped choosing. Neither of them moved. Neither spoke. The moment stretched thin, fragile, terminal. I exhaled. "I will bring this to light," I told them. "I don't need your permission. I don't need your blessing." I lifted the folder and tucked it under my arm. "I'll see you in court." I turned toward the door, every instinct urging me forward, telling me not to look back. But I stopped. Just once, just long enough to say the words I hadn't known I'd been carrying. "Family," I whispered, "is what you fight for, not what you sell." And then I left. The door clicked softly behind me. Outside, the sky stretched gray and endless. The wind caught the edges of my coat. The tears came, hot, silent, relentless. But I kept walking, because whatever they believed they could take from me, they would never take my will to fight. Not again. I didn't sleep much after that night. There was no retreat, no undoing what had been said, no erasing what I had uncovered. The court date was set 2 weeks out. 2 weeks to prepare for the most consequential battle of my life. Not against enemies on foreign soil, against my own blood. And I knew I couldn't face it alone. That's when I reached out to the only kind of help I trusted. Off the books, off the record, and unconditionally loyal. We called ourselves Shadowline. Not officially, it wasn't a sanctioned unit, wasn't supposed to exist. Just a loose network of former intelligence operatives, cyber defense specialists, and human assets whose lives, like mine, had been constructed in the margins. I contacted Anna first, an old friend, former NSA. She answered on the first ring. "Been waiting for this call," she said, her voice low. "What do you need?" Within 48 hours, she had connected me with 2 others. Miles, a cybersecurity prodigy with access to every digital vault from DC to Dubai, and Cole, a former psych operations officer who could read a human mind like an open map. We convened at an abandoned cabin 3 hours outside the city. Neutral ground, no cell signals, no surveillance. I laid everything out, the fraud, the laundering, the ties to Arvos International, the coded communications, the forged identities. They didn't flinch. When I finished, Anna shook her head slowly. "This isn't small," she murmured. "You understand that. This is multi-layered. The kind of operation that doesn't just ruin lives, it gets people disappeared." "I know," I said quietly. "That's precisely why I can't stop." Miles opened his tablet and within minutes was already cross-referencing data, flagging anomalies. Cole filled a legal pad with patterns, murmuring to himself in that detached, almost eerie way he always had. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. I wasn't alone anymore, and yet the weight in my chest didn't ease. That night, back in the sterile quiet of my apartment, I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker and drifted into memory. I was 9 years old, sitting on the front porch, watching my parents argue through the thin glass of the living room window. Lucas was inside, as always, the center of everything. I remembered the precise words my mother had spoken, even though I hadn't fully understood them at the time. Some children are easier to love. I had carried those words onto every battlefield, through every late-night mission, into every moment when fear and doubt pressed close. And somehow, even now, they return to haunt me. I shook the memory loose and forced myself back to the present. The following week was consumed with preparation. We constructed profiles, traced offshore accounts, secured counterintelligence evidence capable of standing up in both civilian court and, if necessary, federal inquiry. But with each breakthrough came greater danger. Another anonymous message appeared. Not a call this time, but an envelope slipped beneath my door in the middle of the night. No return address. Inside, one sentence, typed in block letters: "Stand down or we take what's left." I burned it without hesitation because fear was no longer a viable option. By day 8, we had the complete blueprint, a digital map of the financial network Lucas and Eva had constructed. Names, accounts, access codes. We had even traced physical meeting locations between Eva and foreign intermediaries. One of them captured on surveillance footage leaving the embassy of a hostile nation. It was more than sufficient, but the fear, quiet, corrosive, never fully departed. I dreamed of Lucas's face, of my father's voice telling me I had never truly belonged, of standing alone on the playground in 2nd grade while other children clustered together and shut me out. Even as an adult, even with a team at my side, the feeling persisted, alone. But here's what they never tell you about soldiers, about survivors. We moved forward anyway. The night before the hearing, Anna pressed a small flash drive into my hand. "This is everything," she said. "Everything you need." I nodded. Cole studied me with his unreadable expression. "Are you ready for what comes after?" I met his eyes directly. "I've been ready my entire life." And I meant it. Because when family becomes the enemy, the war stops being about winning. It becomes about surviving. And tomorrow, I intended to survive. The day of the hearing arrived with the cold clarity of a battlefield dawn. I dressed in my full uniform, not for theatrics, not for sympathy, but because it was the truth of who I was and who I had always been, long before they tried to rewrite my story. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected. Pale walls, fluorescent lighting, too unremarkable for what was about to unfold within it. Lucas sat across from me, flanked by Eva and their legal team. He didn't meet my gaze. Eva offered me a brittle smile, the same one she had worn the first time she joined the family, years before any of this began. My parents occupied the 2nd row. My mother clutched a tissue she barely used. My father's hands lay folded and motionless, his face deliberately neutral. I took my seat without a word. Their attorney spoke first, a woman sharp as shattered glass, her voice fluid and practiced. She painted me as cold, manipulative, a woman so consumed by personal ambition that she had stolen from her own blood. She framed sacrifice as a character flaw. She spoke of service as though it were a form of abandonment. I sat motionless through every word. When my deployments were weaponized against me, when my absence was used as proof that I was less of a daughter and less of a sister, I didn't flinch. When they suggested the psychological toll of combat had damaged me beyond recovery, that I was unstable, perhaps even dangerous, I didn't blink. I had been called worse by people far more threatening. I thought of Afghanistan, the relentless desert wind, the way the sun bleached bone until it gleamed like polished ivory, the way we learned, again and again, that sometimes silence was the only form of survival. And so I stayed silent. Even as Eva took the stand, her voice trembling, her hands folded neatly in her lap, describing how she had tried to reach me, how she had watched me change, how she had feared for the family. I said nothing. It was masterful in its way, the lies, the half-truths, the weaponized sentimentality. The judge listened without expression, and I waited. I waited through the legal proceedings, through the methodically constructed character assassination, through the false tears and the rehearsed compassion. Until finally, it was my turn. I rose. I did not look at Lucas, Eva, or my parents. I looked only at the judge. "Your Honor," I said, my voice unwavering. "I won't consume the court's time with a defense of my character. That isn't why I'm here." I reached into my case and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "I have one document to submit," I continued quietly. "I believe it will clarify the nature of this situation entirely." I crossed the floor, each step measured, deliberate, and placed the paper gently on the bench. The courtroom fell silent, profoundly silent. The judge adjusted his glasses and began to read. I watched the shift unfold, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. His eyes narrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. He read to the end, then read it a second time. And then, without looking up, he spoke 4 words that changed everything. "No one leaves. Close the doors." The bailiff blinked, startled, then moved. The room transformed. Not with noise, not with chaos, but with breathless, suspended confusion. Lucas went rigid. Eva's eyes began to dart. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's carefully maintained blankness finally fractured, giving way to something I couldn't quite identify. Fear, perhaps, or the first flicker of recognition. The doors closed, locks engaged, and then they arrived. Federal agents, moving swiftly and with controlled purpose. One moved directly toward Lucas, another toward Eva. A third approached the bench and leaned in close. The judge nodded sharply. Eva's voice cracked first. What is this? This is insane." Lucas rose from his chair. "Sit down," the agent ordered. "Now." I stood perfectly still. My heart pounded, but my breathing stayed level. I had witnessed raids before. I had authorized them. But standing on this side of one, watching the methodical dismantling of a lie constructed over years, felt both surreal and, in some deep way, inevitable. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Merritt, Ms. Merritt, you are being detained under suspicion of financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit cyber espionage against the United States government." Eva's composure dissolved completely, tears streaming freely. Lucas's face contorted, not with guilt, but with undisguised fury. My parents said nothing. I held my mother's gaze for one brief moment, but there was nothing left there to reach for. The agents moved with efficiency. Restraints clicked. Documents were gathered. The courtroom, so full of polished fabrications only moments before, lay stripped bare. I turned to the judge. "With the court's permission," I said softly, "I'd like to request immediate protective custody for any veterans whose identities were compromised and a formal investigation into the laundering channels involved." He nodded without hesitation. And just like that, it was done. No more silence. No more shadows. No more pretending. The paper had been enough. The truth had always been enough. The sound of the handcuffs was quieter than I expected. Not the sharp clatter of the movies. No shouting, no slamming, just the soft mechanical click of metal on wrist. The calm, practiced movements of federal agents who had conducted this procedure far too many times before. Lucas didn't resist. He barely moved. Eva's composure shattered entirely. She sobbed loudly, without restraint, shaking her head and repeating over and over, "I didn't mean. This wasn't supposed to happen." Lucas was silent. His eyes found mine once, briefly. And for the first time in months, perhaps years, I didn't see smugness. I didn't see cold calculation. I saw something else entirely. I saw defeat. I saw the boy I had once known. The one who built wooden forts with me in the backyard, who dared me to climb 2 tall trees and stretched out his hand when I slipped. And for one brief, agonizing moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The agents recited the charges with mechanical detachment. Conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, cyber espionage, violation of national security protocols. Lucas didn't blink. My parents sat frozen and pale, as though a single wrong movement might shatter them. My mother's lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear. My father simply stared, hands still folded, as though this were some distant nightmare that hadn't yet fully reached him. I should have felt vindicated, but the truth is I felt nothing clean. I kept hearing my own voice in my head, the words I had thrown at them. Family is choice. I'm not the one who stopped choosing, but some buried, bitter part of me remembered something else too. I remembered the pressures both Lucas and I had grown up beneath. The expectations, the relentless comparisons. Lucas had been the golden child because he had to be, because every time he stumbled, my father's disappointment descended like a hammer, because every time he failed, my mother's quiet disappointment cut deeper than anything spoken. And I had been the escape artist, the one who left. I remember the night before my first deployment, Lucas drunk in the driveway, slurring something about how I got to escape while he was left behind with their dreams. I remembered the way he looked at me, not with hatred, but with envy. And that's what no one tells you about betrayal. It is rarely born from pure malice. More often, it emerges from pain. The agents guided them both past me. Eva refused to meet my eyes. Lucas did, and just before they let him through the door, he said it, quiet, barely audible. They made me. I could have dismissed it. Another lie, another deflection, but I didn't, because the real truth is rarely absolute. I sat down, my knees trembling in a way the rest of me refused to acknowledge. My hands stayed folded. My breathing stayed controlled. But inside, something was fracturing. The courtroom slowly emptied. My parents remained seated, motionless. I don't know how long I sat before I finally rose and approached them carefully, the way you approach something wild and fragile. My mother's eyes were unfocused. My father's face was hollow. For the first time, they appeared simply old, not cruel, not monstrous, just small, diminished. I spoke quietly. "You should go home." My mother blinked. A tear slipped free and she didn't wipe it away. Then she whispered something I will never forget. We just wanted him to be someone." The words landed harder than any accusation, because in that moment I understood. They had wanted Lucas to succeed because they had failed themselves, because he had become the vessel for every dream they'd lost, the ambitions they'd pinned too tightly, too selfishly. And when I left, when I became something beyond their control, he was all they had left to shape. He broke. They broke him. I exhaled, measured, contained. But deep inside, the weight of that understanding carved a hollow I didn't know how to fill. I left them there. I did not look back. Later, alone in my apartment, I sat by the window watching the lights blur into the night, and I thought about every choice I had made. Every time I had chosen distance over closeness. Every time I had buried myself in work, in missions, in walls built too high for anyone to scale. I thought about how Lucas wasn't the only one shaped by expectation. How in some terrible way, we had both been broken by the same hands. And I knew I would carry that weight long after the case was closed. Because justice isn't healing, and winning isn't the same as peace. But still, I had chosen, and that choice was mine. The world erupted before I had even made it home. By the time I stepped through my front door, my phone was vibrating continuously. Calls, messages, news alerts, headlines everywhere. Decorated army, colonel exposes family espionage ring. Hero or betrayer. The Elara Merritt story. Family scandal rocks military community. Family or country. The unthinkable choice of a soldier. My face was on every screen. Photographs pulled from deployment archives, old interviews, blurred images taken on the courthouse steps. The story wasn't merely national. It was viral, and with it came the flood. Some called me a hero. Messages poured in from veterans, military spouses, strangers who said I had given them hope, who said I had proven that truth still mattered. But others painted me as the villain, accused me of dismantling my family out of arrogance, greed, or some twisted compulsion to be right at any cost. Family is sacred, one commentator declared on a late-night program. What kind of person destroys their own blood like this? I watched it all in silence. I didn't respond. I didn't correct the narratives. I didn't explain, because if there is one thing the military instilled in me, it's that silence is a form of strength. Not every battle demands a reply. Not every shot demands to be returned. I sat alone on my couch, phone face down, television on mute. The apartment felt too quiet, too still. And yet beneath the numbness, something pulsed. A low, steady rhythm I recognized from combat's aftermath. That space where adrenaline dissolves but the consequences linger. I thought of Lucas, of his expression when the handcuffs engaged, of the words he had barely breathed. They made me. I thought of my mother's voice, reduced to something small and broken. We just wanted him to be someone. I thought of the little girl I once was, sitting on the porch in the dark, listening to the arguments inside, wondering why she always felt like she was standing outside the frame. The wave of public attention lifted me, then dragged me under. One moment, strangers online called me a symbol of integrity. The next, anonymous voices accused me of cruelty, of being less than human. I could feel myself oscillating, rising and falling, rising again. And then I recalled something my old CEO had told me during my first deployment. When everything felt too vast, too overwhelming to withstand, hold the line. Even when the ground shifts, even when the noise is deafening, hold the line. So I did. I switched off the television. I closed the news feeds. I made tea. Simple, steady. And I reminded myself why I had done this. Not for recognition, not for punishment. Because it was right. Because silence isn't simply the absence of sound. Sometimes silence is the only way to survive. The controversy ignited more rapidly than I had anticipated. Within hours of the verdict, the story was everywhere. Lucas and Eva in federal custody, multiple charges pending, but my parents untouched. The official statement was clinical. Due to advanced age and underlying health conditions, Mr. and Mrs. Merritt are not currently facing prosecution. But the public cared nothing for legal nuance. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Top programs erupted. Commentators raged. Social media divided itself in two. Some argued that mercy had been the correct course, that subjecting frail, elderly people to prosecution would serve no justice, only cruelty. But others, many others, were furious. They signed those papers. One headline declared, "They watched this unfold." Another insisted, "Why do they walk free while others face consequences?" The anger built in waves. Hashtags trended. Petitions spread. Even people who had supported me initially began questioning everything. I became the face of the controversy whether I sought it or not. Every camera found me. Every microphone stretched closer. "What do you have to say about your parents, Colonel Merritt? Do you believe justice was served? Did you push for leniency?" I said nothing. Not once. Not to any of them. The night after the story broke, I stood alone on my balcony, phone dark in my pocket, and listened to the city breathe beneath me. I thought of my parents sitting in that same living room where so much of this had originated. I imagined my mother's trembling hands, my father's vacant gaze. I thought about the weight of their choices and the weight of mine, and I thought quietly and bitterly how none of it felt like victory. I could still hear my mother's voice. We just wanted him to be someone. I could still see Lucas's face, haunted, hollow, as they let him out. It would have been simple enough to issue a statement, to clarify that I had played no role in the prosecutor's decisions, that this had never been about revenge, that I had sought only the truth, not their destruction. But I didn't, because no words would have mattered. Not to those who already despised me, not to those eager to elevate me, and certainly not to the family I'd already lost. So I held the line. I let the headlines burn. I let the world spin. And I remembered something an old intelligence officer had told me in a briefing room in Kabul, words that had carried me through deserts, through battles, through years of invisible wars. Sometimes the loudest voice is the one that says nothing at all. I stayed silent, because silence is not surrender. Silence is survival. The first time I saved a life, I was 24 years old. It didn't happen on the front lines, not amid the chaos of combat. It happened inside a dusty medical tent miles from anything resembling civilization. A young corporal, barely more than a boy, bleeding from shrapnel wounds. I remember the weight of his body as we lifted him, the way his eyes locked onto mine, terrified and pleading. I remember whispering over and over, "Hold on, just hold on." And he did. That moment never left me. Not through the years, not through the battles, not through the betrayals. And now, standing at the threshold of something new, I thought of him again. Because saving people doesn't always look the way you imagine it will. The Sentinel Foundation began with nothing but an idea, a whisper in need. I funded it quietly at first. No press, no announcements. Just a small group of trusted allies who understood what it meant to serve and to return home fractured. Our mission was simple: to protect those who could no longer protect themselves. Veterans defrauded, manipulated, discarded by systems too broken to notice them. We offered legal assistance, cyber defense, identity protection, counseling. But more than anything, we offered something I had once gone years without: someone who believed you were worth saving. Some days it felt insignificant, like bailing water from a ship already listing. But then a letter would arrive. A quiet thank you. A story of how a single intervention had redirected the course of someone's life. And I kept going. I thought back to the nights spent lying awake in desert silence, listening for the crack of distant gunfire, the rush of approaching helicopters, the fear that never fully released its grip. I thought of the faces, friends who made it home in body, but not always in spirit. Names etched into marble walls. Stories that ended too soon. And I made a promise: whatever time I had remaining, I would spend it fighting for them. For those who served. For those who were forgotten. For those who, like me, had been broken but refused to remain that way. People began attaching names to me: advocate, survivor, hero. I had no need for the labels. All I needed was the work. Because the truth is, I wasn't only saving others. I was saving myself. One case at a time. One life at a time. One quiet victory in a world still full of shadows. The letter arrived on a quiet Thursday morning. No ceremony, no announcement, just a plain white envelope with no return address, slipped into the pile of bills and advertisements. I almost let it pass, but something, instinct perhaps, made me pause. I sat at the kitchen table, sunlight filtering through the blinds, the city moving softly outside. I opened the envelope and withdrew a single sheet of paper. Handwritten, neat, careful. It began simply: "Dear Colonel Merritt, you don't know us, but because of you, our family is still whole." I read it once, then again. They shared their story: how a fraudulent veterans charity had drained their savings, how they had nearly lost everything, how no one listened until someone from the Sentinel Foundation intervened, halted the fraud, recovered their funds, and shielded them from future harm. They wrote about fear, about shame, about the silent weight of being deceived and left behind. And then, near the end, they wrote something that caught in my throat. "We thought we didn't matter, that no one would fight for us. But then you did." I sat very still. The letter trembled slightly in my hands, not from weakness, but from something else. I thought of that first soldier, the look in his eyes as we pulled him back from the edge, the weight of his life in my arms, the way time had stretched and bent in that moment, everything else falling away except the pure determination not to let go. This was the same thing, a different battlefield, the same fight. Something stirred inside me, something unfamiliar, something I had not permitted myself to feel in longer than I could name. A smile, small, tentative, but real. I traced the words with my fingertips, the paper soft beneath my skin, and for the first time in years, longer perhaps, I felt lightness. Not the absence of grief, not the erasure of what had happened, just the quiet, steady truth that life could still offer small moments of grace. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beside my medals. The city outside kept moving. The news kept churning. The world remained loud and restless. But inside, in that stillness, I held on to one truth. Saving people doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with silence. Sometimes it arrives in a single letter. And sometimes that is enough. I stood at the water's edge as the first light broke across the horizon. The ocean stretched endless in every direction, quiet and unhurried. The air was sharp with salt, the breeze cool against my skin. I closed my eyes and listened. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was peace. Not the absence of memory, not the erasure of pain, just the simple, still quiet that arrives when you have carried the weight, faced the storm, and somehow managed to come through. I thought of every step that had led me here. I thought of Lucas, the boy he once was, the man he became, and the choices he made along the way. I thought of my parents, of what they gave me and what they took away. I thought of the battles I had fought overseas, the ones waged alone in the dark corners of my own mind, the ones fought here on home soil, where no one applauded, no one saluted, and no one kept score. And I thought of the people still carrying their own unseen wars, strangers, survivors, the voices I had encountered through the Sentinel Foundation, who reminded me daily why the fight still mattered. There is something the military teaches you that rarely gets spoken aloud. Not every battle is loud. Some are fought in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in the quiet spaces between breaths where choices are made and lives are changed forever. Some battles you don't choose, but you fight them anyway. Not for vengeance, not for recognition, but because sometimes the line between right and wrong is not blurred at all, is clear, and someone has to stand on the right side of it. I opened my eyes. The waves moved in steady rhythm. The wind murmured through the grass. And somewhere behind me, the weight of the past no longer pressed quite so heavily against my shoulders. I let the silence stretch, let the air fill my lungs, because I had learned something else, too. Some battles are fought in silence, and sometimes that silence is the loudest victory of all. I stood there for a long time, just breathing, just being, and when I finally turned away, I carried that stillness with me, not as armor, as grace. Before we part, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup in hand, or a late night when stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read every one with gratitude. And if this story moved you in some way, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this one, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for giving us your time today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry something from this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't arrive at your door. It waits patiently until you are ready to open your heart. Take care. We'll see you in the next story.